Welcome to part two, Jewish time and Jewish space. Today we're talking about Jewish time, which doesn't mean that I'm going to be late. I just want to clarify that. When I say Jewish time, I'm not saying, oh, they call it for 8. Oh, we'll show up at 8:30. No, that's a different Jewish time. I'm talking about Jewish time, like Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah, and the 10-day period that Israel created in from Memorial Day for Holocaust to Independence Day, which starts tomorrow night. But before we go into the specifics of this 10-day period, which, as I mentioned last week, complement, supplement, contribute to, and I think are in conversation with the 10 days of awe that we commemorate from the beginning of Tishrei, the high holiday period, Rosh Hashanah, until Yom Kippur, Israel created this sacred space. I read from Avram Yeshua Heschel, the great German-born American rabbi, who talks about the sanctification of time in his book, The Shabbat. Judaism is a religion of time, aiming at the sanctification of time. Unlike the space-minded man, to whom time is unvaried, iterative, homogeneous, to whom all hours are alike, qualityless, empty shells, the Bible senses the diversified character of time. There are no 2 hours alike. Every hour is unique, and the only one given at the moment, exclusive and endlessly precious. Judaism teaches us to be attached to holiness in time, to be attached to sacred events, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of a year. Shabbatot are great cathedrals, and our Holy of Holies is a shrine that neither the Romans nor the Germans were able to burn, a shrine that even apostasy cannot easily obliterate, the Day of Atonement, right? Our most sacred time. According to the ancient rabbis, it is not the observance of the Day of Atonement, but the day itself, the essence of the day, which, with man's repentance, atones for the sins of man. Jewish ritual may be characterized by the art of significant forms in time, as architecture of time. I've been to your synagogue. I know you guys have an incredible synagogue, possibly one of the nicest ones that I have. Hold it, somebody wants to join here, and I think I have to add them. Possibly one of the nicest synagogues that I've been to, but Heschel speaks about architecture of time. Most of our observances, Shabbat, New Moon, Rosh Chodesh we experienced this week, the festivals, the sabbatical and Jubilee year, depend on a certain hour of the day or season of the year. It is, for example, the evening, morning, or afternoon prayer, which brings with it the call to prayer. The main themes of faith lie in the realm of time. We remember the day of Exodus from Egypt, the day when Israel stood at Mount Sinai, which we recount every Friday night in our Kiddush. Remember, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, Zecher L'Maseh Bereshit, the Exodus from Egypt, creation, and our Messianic hope in the expectation of a day of the end of days. A brief piece, phenomenal actually. I was in Yad Vashem today with a special group, the Holocaust Museum that I talked about last week, and we met the chief, now he's in charge of foreign relations, but formerly the chief archivist of Yad Vashem, and he took us into the archive. I've only been there a handful of times in my many years of guiding, and he showed us this crazy piece of paper written on both sides in Hebrew. It was a Hebrew calendar that survived Buchenwald. And he said it's incredible that it had all the Shabbat, it had all the Hebrew months on it, with the Gregorian months, and it had the Shabbatot, and it had the holidays, and it had the weekly portions of the Torah that we read. He said, why is somebody going to length of putting this together in Buchenwald? Not just to show you that today was Tuesday, but today was the 2nd of Iyar, or the 3rd of Iyar, actually, which is a day before the Memorial Day, a day before we have Independence Day. And the notion, even in Buchenwald, that you need a calendar, not just to tell you where you are today, but there's going to be a future that the next holiday we'll celebrate is something else, gives you a sense, I think, of what Avraham Heschel talked about, and I just thought about that because I saw that literally 5 or 6 hours ago in Yad Vashem. Pretty incredible when we think about how different I think Judaism is than many other traditions. We have 3 national, I call them holy days. You can call them holidays. The first one started 6 minutes ago. Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, L'Shoah, L'Gevurah, for last week, Holocaust and Heroism, which was last week, the 27th of Nisan. And that day, by the way, is connected to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. More of that later. And then starting 7 minutes ago now, Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers and Victims of Terrorism. That is the 4th of Iyar. And starting tomorrow night, when Memorial Day ends, Independence Day, Yom Ha'Atzmaut, begins and lasts until Friday just before Shabbat. How did they set these dates? I mean, it's in the Bible. You shall celebrate on the 14th of Nisan, the Exodus from Egypt. You shall celebrate on the 1st of Tishrei, the beginning of the new year, Rosh Hashanah. But why the national holidays in Israel? Well, there are 2 anchors. The first one is Holocaust, and the last one is independence. So, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising which began on the day of Passover, the 15th of Nisan in 1943, was the 19th of April 43. And when the founding fathers and mothers in the first decade of Israel wanted to create a day, right, to sanctify that day, to remember, as Heschel reminded us, to remember the Holocaust, the Shoah, they wanted something that they could identify with. So was it the day that Hitler came to power? Was it the day the first intentional mass murder began, the first transport of Jews to Auschwitz? They chose not even the liberation, but they chose the day around or connected to, close to, the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. There were multiple uprisings in ghettos and in the forests and in concentration camps, and even in a couple of the death camps, Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka. But they wanted to connect to the story of heroism, of the Jews fighting back in the Warsaw Ghetto. The problem, of course, was that was the first day of Passover. You can't have a Memorial Day on Passover, and so they set it a few days after Passover, right? Last week, Passover ended on Saturday night in Israel, and already on Tuesday was Memorial Day for Yom HaShoah. And why that day and not a day before or a day after? In order to make this 10-day period from the date of the 15th, the date of the Warsaw, the date of Memorial Day for fallen soldiers on the 27th of Nisan, and Independence Day. Independence Day was declared on May 14th, 1948, which is the Hebrew calendar date of the 5th of Iyar. So if you want to create a 10-day period to sanctify time, as we for millennia have sanctified the period of, we call the days of awe, or the high holidays, from Yom Kippur to Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, if one anchor must be Israeli independence, let's move 10 days back from that, connect it to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and voila, we've created these 3 new days of commemoration and celebration. Holocaust, Memorial Day for soldiers and victims of terror, and finally ending with Israeli independence. Is there a linkage? No question. We saw last week how the finance minister Levi Eshkol in 1962 said that there's definitely a connection between the birth of the state of Israel and the Holocaust. And there is a narrative, I think I spoke about it for those of you who were with me last week, Shoah l'tkuma in Hebrew, Shoah, from Holocaust to rebirth. Is there a connection between the two? People oftentimes say, Mike, in America we hear a lot, our kids on college campuses, that Israel is only here because of the Holocaust, and the world felt bad for the Jews and basically usurped an indigenous population of Palestinians and put them with, Jews who were colonized, the surviving Jews of Europe. What do you say to that? I say, well, first of all, it neglects the fact that from the 1890s or even 1880s, Jews were moving back to Palestine. 1897, there was the first Zionist Congress. Jews have been wanting to come back to the land for 2,000 years. There is a connection. And I like to say that it's not that the Holocaust happened, that Israel was born because of the Holocaust. I say that Israel was born despite the Holocaust. Very important that there is a connection, but not a dependence, if that makes any sense in terms of the modern conversation of Israel, Holocaust, Palestinians, etc. So here we've got this period. It's a painting in the background of by Morsi Gottlieb, a very talented Polish from Krakow, outside of Krakow, Jewish painter who died in his early 20s. This is Days of Awe. It's this painting. It's in the Tel Aviv Art Museum. It's him in different periods of his life. There he is, there he is, there he is, and maybe there he might have been had he have not taken his life in his 20s with his mistress or his girlfriend up above, who was from a very wealthy family, who did not like the fact that this bohemian artist was trying to be the suitor of their daughter. On the background of Gottlieb's picture of the high holidays, as I mentioned before, we celebrate these 10 days of repentance, these Asara Yemei Tshuva, 1st to the 10th of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. The period in Israel between Yom HaShoah last week, or Memorial Day for Shoah, I should say, and the end of Yom Ha'Atzmaut, as I already mentioned, can be seen as this parallel, rival, complementary to the Days of Awe as our Israeli sacred time that we've created in the past 74 years. We were reminded of the tragedy of Jewish life in the diaspora and the Shoah, connected perhaps in some way, shape, or form to the birth of Israel, continues to the heavy price that we pay by living in this neighborhood, endeavoring to live in a peaceful neighborhood, and ends, as I say, ultimately with the celebration of Israeli sovereignty tomorrow night at Independence Day, a transition from the past to a new reality celebrated by the new Jew, somebody who was created in a fundamentally different way, the Ari ben Canaan, as it were, in the modern state of Israel, who becomes the center of Israeli sovereignty. Are these the high holy days of Israeli civic religion? Both religious and secular Israelis, not the ultra-Orthodox, by the way, commemorate these days. You might be surprised, but the ultra-Orthodox, yes, you can understand they don't stop, unfortunately, for the siren on Memorial Day for fallen soldiers. They don't serve in the military. They don't celebrate Independence Day, because both of those are symbols of the modern state of Israel, which they, at least theologically, are opposed to. Even Holocaust Memorial Day, although many of the people killed were ultra-Orthodox in Europe, Jews in Europe, they don't recognize the fact that this is a specific day for the Shoah. There are other memorial days in the year, the 9th of Av, 17th of Tammuz, that they commemorate as days of destruction of Jewish life. And any linkage to the state of Israel is something that they are not fond of, and therefore don't commemorate. Some do stop at attention for the siren, but walk through. I was in Tel Aviv last week at 10 a.m. for the siren for Holocaust Memorial Day. If I was in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods of Jerusalem, I guarantee you, a lot of people would just keep on walking. One of our great authors, who's I'm in the midst of a book of reading right now, not now, because I'm talking to you guys, but before, I literally read a chapter just before I got on with you. A.B. Hoshua, lives in Haifa, wrote a piece in the late 80s called The Wall and the Mountain. And in many ways, I think this piece kind of gives us insight into the tension, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? You need high tension and positive, right? There's high tension electricity and pressure and everything. Tension isn't always bad, but the tension between the ancient repository of memory in and around the old city of Jerusalem and the contemporary repository of memory that I talked about last week, the mountain of memory, comprised of those three areas: Mount Herzl, which include the military cemetery, the tomb of Theodor Herzl and the great leaders of the nation, and on the other side, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. Listen to what Yeshua writes in 1987. The ceremonies around Memorial Independence Day have once again revealed the vast difference between the two sites, which are formally utilized by the State of Israel, the Western Wall and Mount Herzl. Memorial Day for the Fallen, and when he wrote this in 87, it wasn't called what it is today. Today it is called Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terror. It's something that has changed in the past 25 years. The date today, as we speak, not just in my suburban community of Modi'in, but it opens the ceremony at the Western Wall. There's a picture in the background. On the other hand, the opening ceremony for Independence Day and celebrations on Mount Herzl, on the other side of town, reveal to us a place full of grandeur, power, and clear symbols of hope, a place which serves as the context for an impressive occasion which could be a source of pride of any nation, right? So it's a national holiday, not in the ancient repository of memory, right? Two very different spaces. Herzl's grave in the center, on Mount Herzl, is that of a unifying and beloved figure. The military cemetery, the second component, gives dignity and honor to those who sacrificed their lives for the independence of all of us. Yad Vashem, the third element, emphasizes the moral justification for establishing the state, both in terms of the inner account of the nation and in terms of the account between us, the Arabs, and other nations of the world. This museum balances Jewish history superbly between exile and restoration. So you've got these two epicenters of repositories of memory. When people come to Israel and Jerusalem, I say, listen, you need to spend a day at least in and around the old city to understand why this city is so important to us as Jews and to Christians and Muslims, another 3.5 billion people. But also you need to understand this mountain of memory that we visited last week that is the epicenter of both Jewish modern space and Jewish modern time. We'll begin with day one last week. The official name you might know is Yom HaShoah, but it's actually called Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, Shoah, to Holocaust, and to heroism. Who's Holocaust? Well, the 6 million victims. Who are the heroes? You'll see that in just a couple minutes' time in the context of this sculpture, which sits in Warsaw Ghetto Square, the entrance to the museum. These are the heroes, the ghetto fighters, larger than life, in this amazing relief by the Jewish French artist Nathan Rappaport. Actually, no, it's Polish, Russian. He was in France, he was in Russia in the war, but he built, for the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Warsaw, he built this two-sided memorial sculpture. This is the front, the ghetto fighters. The backside you'll see in a few minutes, called The Last March. We have already, before Israel came around, before the Shoah tragically happened, a number of memorial days, particularly the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which commemorates many events, most importantly, the destruction of the first and second temples. There are others, the 17th of Tammuz, as I mentioned, but this was a new date created by the founding fathers and mothers in the early days of the country, as I mentioned. Why? To link it to the Warsaw Ghetto. I already mentioned this, so don't read it all. Since we can't have a Memorial Day then, in 1959, the law was established calling for it to be 12 days after the actual uprising on the 27th of Nisan, which, by the way, don't tell me, Mike, or ask me, tell me, are the are the Jewish holidays late or early this year? My wife and I are thinking of going to America. We are to Canada and America this summer. I might even see you in Chicago sometime in September. And we're debating whether to come back for Rosh Hashanah or not. And she says to me, well, is it early or late? I said, it's the first of Tishrei. What do you mean, is it early or late? No, I mean, is it early September or late September? It's the 24th and 25th, I think. Anyway, what is it named? Why is it called Yom HaShoah? What is Shoah? Well, Holocaust is a Greek word. And Holocaust is a term for a type of sacrifice in the temple. The 6 million were not sacrificed, they were murdered because they had a Jewish grandparent. And so the day is called Yom HaShoah, Holocaust in English, but it's not the same significance, I believe. And heroism. Who were the heroes? The ghetto fighters. The few, 35 is Jewish paratroopers from Palestine who trained with the British, Chana Senesh, the most famous, who parachuted behind Nazi-occupied lines in Europe to try to warn the Jewish communities there about what was happening. And the partisans, remember the movie Defiance, the Bielski brothers? That is what Israel referred to, or those are the people they referred to in terms of heroism. It's changed a lot, thankfully. And today, Israel and Yad Vashem recognizes that heroism is not just the people who fought back, knowing most of them were and ultimately did die, but even the people who shared that last piece of bread in a camp, knowing that it might have kept you alive another day or two, but you were willing to share it with somebody else. Loads and loads of forms of heroism, not, quote, just those physically fighting back. As I say, it mentions, references the 6 million, as I said already before. Now, images we're all familiar with of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It takes from the night of the 14th, when we're supposed to sit around having a Passover Seder in Warsaw. There's 60,000 Jews there, and the Germans want to send the remaining Jews out to be murdered. Keep in mind, earlier, almost a year before, in July and August of 1942, 250,000 Jews are sent out from Warsaw. Just in terms of numbers, there were 350,000 Jews in Warsaw before the war began, a third of the city. There came another 100,000 Jews from smaller communities nearby that were put into the Warsaw Ghetto created in the fall of 1940, and 100,000 died by 42. So you're left with 350,000. 250,000 are sent out. Many more die afterwards and are sent to other places. So the Germans take until the 16th of May to totally level the Warsaw Ghetto. These are pictures of what the ghetto looked like afterwards, and these iconic images. I put this here because I want you to see the faces on the one hand of the Jews ultimately who were killed by the Germans with the level everything. And you can see, you can't even really make out the faces of the Germans. These are pictures taken by Germans, by the way. You can see their helmets and their bayonets, right? I want you to see that in the second part of Rappaport's sculpture inside of Yad Vashem. More famous pictures, iconic pictures. These were people, a young girl over here. Of course, the most famous probably is this young boy surrendering. These were the Jews, the few hundred Jews left alive inside the Warsaw Ghetto, uprising refusing to surrender to the Germans. So 5 years after the uprising ends, in Poland, in April, on the 19th of April, why the 19th of April? Mike, you just told us you can't have a Memorial Day on Pesach. Well, Pesach isn't the 19th of April. It might have been in 1943, but Pesach is the 14th of Nisan. So in the Hebrew calendar, it changes based on the Gregorian. But in the Polish calendar, April 19th was an act of heroic resistance of Polish Jews against the Germans. And so this memorial was dedicated in Warsaw by Natan Rappaport. When Yad Vashem opens, it creates a square where the main ceremony, last week, the president and the prime minister and the former prime minister and the chief justice of the Supreme Court and the speaker of the Bundestag, the German parliament, sat next to the speaker of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, Miki Levy, last week. And there's a whole long ceremony in front of this sculpture. In Warsaw, if you've been there, it looks different. This is in the front and this is on the back. This is the heroism. Look at the images. There you can see the defiant face of maybe Mordecai Levitch, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Larger than life. I mean, it's a picture of both of them. You can see the dimensions of the people here versus the dimensions of the people here. downtrodden, broken, but using whatever primitive weapons they could get their hands on. In contrast, on the right, you can see over here people looking down, except this child looking out at us. And you can see this person looking back, maybe at her husband who might have fallen. And this woman over here is looking at her unborn, where is it? Unborn baby. The rabbi I've circled over here who's looking up to heaven. There is the woman looking backwards. There is the child looking at us. I should have done this first, sorry. There is and there's a quote from the circumcision, B'damai chai, you shall live with your blood. And in the background, I don't know if you can see, there's the helmeted Nazi. Can you make him out over there with his bayonet? Dehumanized by the Jewish sculptor wanting to say, okay, here is a story of what happened to the Jews in Europe. Some, the minority, physically resisted. The majority went, as the image says, on a last march, not knowing, or maybe yes knowing, where they were going to, but clinging to the hope that eventually, another day, another week, another month, another year, whatever, they needed to continue to stay alive because the hell that they were in the midst of will eventually end. For most of them, unfortunately, it didn't. When people look closely at this image, it's a story of not just 1940, but it could be 1492, the Spanish expulsion of Jews. It could be 70 when the first temple was destroyed. It could be 1066, 1290 when the Jews were kicked out of England, for example. Multiple expulsions. The only component that the artist put in there to tell us that this is 1940s in Germany or in Europe are the bayonets and the helmets of the Nazis. So this event takes place. The law, as I said, from 1959, tells us the date, the 27th of Nisan, to commemorate the disaster. Sorry, it's a bit blurry. This is the only actual document I could find in English on the internet. Acts of heroism and revolt, okay? So it's the disaster and the acts of heroism and revolt. Now, in 1959, the only heroism seen by Israel was the people on the left-hand side. It's changed, by the way, a lot now, and there are two parts of this sculpture. The third part, as it should be a triptych on the left, is an empty wall, in front of which, and you'll see in pictures in a few minutes' time, stand, even this past year, thankfully, we still had 6 survivors who had a video made beforehand. We saw the video on national TV, and they lit one of the 6 candles of commemoration. So to commemorate the disaster, acts of heroism and revolt, we'll be beginning with a 2-minute silence, right, which we just had. We had a minute for now. Tomorrow there's going to be a 2-minute silence and a siren, I should say, at 11 a.m. But Holocaust Memorial Day, a 2-minute siren. Everybody stops doing what they're doing. There are memorial, or is it over here? There are memorial gatherings, popular rallies. This was 11 years into Israeli independence. There it is, signed by David Ben-Gurion, a law sanctifying this time. Now, what happens? A couple things. You can see on the Ayalon Highway in Tel Aviv, on the left-hand side here is a picture, and there is a video that I downloaded from, see if it opens up. It is a video of what happens in Tel Aviv, in the busiest city, 2 minutes time of seeing what's happening. Some people are preparing early when the siren goes off, as it will tomorrow, for Memorial Day for fallen soldiers on Holocaust Day. Fast forward it because I went to the end. What happens as the siren finishes? I don't know if any of you have ever been on a major highway in the United States where everybody stops whatever they're doing in the middle of the day and gets out of their car, but it happens 4 times over the 2 Memorial Days. I mentioned the Holocaust Memorial Ceremony, the official state ceremonies at Yad Vashem. They're held in places all over the country. Here you see internet pictures of survivors with their children or grandchildren lighting the flames. And here you can see, I didn't get one from last week, but here you can see last year. There is the President, Ruby Rivlin, speaking in front of, you can see on the left, the last heroes, the war site, the uprising, sorry, and you can see the last march on the right. And then on the left, over here in dark still, is where the survivors will be lighting their flames. So this kind of triptych on top of the mountain of memory, which is the place where the beginning of that sanctification of Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism takes place. Tonight, a week later, we have 2 holidays that were merged into one. 163, Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers, and recently the addition, as I mentioned, Victims of Terror in 1998. Why? Because there's just a large number of terror victims in the past decades. And the idea, of course, is to create sacred space at the National Cemetery and to create, as we saw last week, and to create sacred time. And the sanctity of the innocent lives killed by terrorism is significant. That has to be commemorated. I think the number is about 3,500, 4,000 through terrorism and about 21,000 through the military. There's the numbers. I just updated this morning, last night, 24,068 soldiers. It's gone up since last year because 56 soldiers and 84 disabled veterans since last year have fallen. Now, what are these numbers? What soldiers have fallen in training accidents? I can remember at the top of my head, a lieutenant colonel and a major were killed by friendly fire in a special unit a few months ago outside of Jerusalem. 2 Air Force pilots, again, a major and a lieutenant colonel, were killed as their helicopter crashed over the Mediterranean. Terror incidents, 15 people killed in terror incidents recently. 3 of them are, one is a security guard, 2 are police. And of the 2 police, 1 is a Christian and 1 is an Arab Druze. And veterans who were wounded in the war died as well as over 3,000 victims of terrorism. Why 1860? That's really not the beginning of Zionism, but the first time Jews lived outside the walls of Jerusalem. 50 plus cemeteries all over the country where there's ceremonies, as well as schools. And in my town, Modin, only was developed 25 years ago. It's a young town. We have in our city a cemetery, a municipal cemetery, and in that cemetery is actually a military cemetery as well. A kid from my kids' high school, between my eldest 2 kids, was killed while he was in service coming home on the highway, unfortunately, in a car accident. So he too, Nadav, is buried in that cemetery, as well as a major and a lieutenant colonel from the Gaza operation in 2014, and unfortunately others. It begins with a siren at the Western Wall, President, Commander-in-Chief. We have another siren tomorrow, as I mentioned, with those ceremonies, all in every school in Israel. Again, my town didn't exist. I mean, just think about it. What major war have we had in 25 years? None. But yet we still have people in our military cemetery. Actually, the husband of a teacher in my kid's school is the major who is in the cemetery. The most bizarre thing happens in Israel. For 25 hours, there is a honor guard at the Western Wall. I'll be there tomorrow. I'll take a picture of it during the day. Here you can see a soldier from the Navy and from the Air Force standing, attention. It's bizarre because it's the Western Wall. Like, why would it not be at this military cemetery? Because the Western Wall, I think, is a symbol of Judaism as both a faith and a nation. And it's unusual because Israeli soldiers can't stand at attention. It's not like the beef eaters in front of Buckingham Palace, right? It's a little bit different. And you can see there's a screen, flame, and the screen runs through the names of all the 24,000 plus victims. You can see as the ceremony begins, soldiers representing various branches of the IDF standing commemoration at the wall. See some other pictures. Remember, and it's broadcast live when I finish with you guys in half an hour. So I'll go downstairs and to put my video back an hour and watch the live ceremony, listen to the speech of the president and the prime minister. More images of the bizarre reality. And I think to try to understand, why is it that Holocaust Memorial Day for soldiers, why do we have this stopping everything we're doing? Because we're such a small country. When you look at Memorial Day in America, it's a day you might go for a picnic, you might go barbecuing. Keep in mind, less than 1% of Americans do military service. Whereas in Israel, it's close to 60% of Israelis, which means that almost everybody has a relative, a friend, a neighbor, unfortunately, who is buried in a military cemetery as a victim of terror. I have 3 kids. Unfortunately, my eldest kid was a medic, and in 2014, 3 of his comrades were killed, and 15 of them were injured. He was involved in evacuating them. He knows those 3 guys. Their names appear in military cemeteries in their towns. In the official, you'll see in a few minutes, a new addition to Mount Herzl. I talked about. We saw it last week with the blocks with the names of all the soldiers. You know, it's something that affects every single person in this very small country of 9.5 million people. And one way I think to understand the heavy price that we pay is given to us by this man who is now on our 200 shekel note, Natan Alterman, one of our national poets, who wrote a very famous poem. He had a weekly column in a newspaper for many, many years. It's called the Hator Hashvi, the 7th column, and it's a poem called The Silver Platter. Here's an English translation of it. It came out in 1947, even before the state of Israel was born. And the land will grow still, he wrote, crimson skies dimming, misting, slowly paling again over smoking frontiers as the nation stands up, torn at heart, but existing to receive its first wonder in 2,000 years. As the moment draws near, it will rise, darkness facing, stand straight in the moonlight in terror and joy. When across from it step out toward it, slowly pacing in plain sight of all, a young girl and a boy, dressed in battle gear, dirty shoes heavy with grime, on the path they will climb up, with their lips remain sealed, while their lips remain sealed to change garb, to wipe brow, they have not yet found time. Still bone weary from days and from nights in the field, full of endless fatigue and all drained of emotion, yet the dew of their youth is still seen on their head. Thus like statues they stand, stiff and still, with no motion and no sign that will show if they live or they are dead. Then a nation in tears and amazed at this matter will ask, who are you? And the 2 of them will say with soft voice, we are the silver platter on which the Jewish state was presented today. And then they fall back in darkness as the day's nation looks, and the rest can be found in the history books. And as such, Alterman, a poem that is still read and studied by children, of course, and is read at state memorials. The heavy price, the silver platter, the state wasn't handed to us in a silver platter. We fought 1% of the population in 1948's War of Independence. 600,000 Jews were killed. We unfortunately still have numbers over 100 of people who died as a result of being in combat and being in uniform. And of course, at memorial sites, including Mount of Olives, a military cemetery from before 1948, where this young soldier stands at attention. You can see the Dome of the Rock in the background. And every single Memorial Day for fallen soldiers, a flag, Israeli flag with a black ribbon is attached to it. Flowers are placed there. Not every soldier has somebody to visit them on Memorial Day, unfortunately, but there's always a soldier at each of the graves, or a group of the graves. My daughter, when she was in military service, had to go one day, and she was assigned a grave up in Haifa, and she was very concerned because I'm going to this grave, and who was it? It was a pilot who was downed in the 73 war, and she was very anxious because what was she going to say? But they wanted to know that the army still remembers their father, son, brother, child, whatever. And she said it was actually a very positive experience. They all spoke about, it was a number of years ago, of course, but they all spoke about the legacy of the soldier who was buried there. Here you can see on the right, Tel Aviv again, people standing at attention in the middle of what they're doing. Mount Herzl Military Cemetery, you can see these pictures I took last year, literally 2 days before Memorial Day began. My youngest son, who thankfully got out of the Air Force after 4 years at the end of December, asked me at the height of Corona, Abba, what are you doing next week? I said, not much. Why? He says, well, are you free for a day? I said, what do you need? He said, can you take my team from the Air Force and his unit to Jerusalem for a day? I said, sure, what would you be interested in? So we built the itinerary. One of the components included Mount Herzl. Now, they're a special unit. They don't have to walk around in uniforms. But I said, guys, if we go to Mount Herzl, you have to put on your uniforms, your dress uniforms in the Air Force. And they're like, yeah. And of course, his commander said, his officer said, you have to wear the uniforms. You'll see them in a minute. But you'll notice the picture of the grave. This is this new structure we talked about last week, in which are the names on a brick of each of the 24,000 people who died, based on the date in the year and the Yortzeit candles lit on that day. And here you see the uniformity of the graves with the flag Next to it, every single year on Memorial Day, there you can see it up a little closer, the flag with the black ribbon, and there is my son's team. This is him over there. That's me over there in their dress uniforms on Mount Herzl. It was fascinating because I'd been hundreds of times with groups. I'd never had the opportunity to guide a group of soldiers there. And these are special. I mean, it's my son. How can he not be special? But it's a special, unusual group. It's a special unit of the Air Force. They're very, very small in numbers. All the men here, the women do 2 years service or 3 years maybe, but all the men do 4 to 6 year service. They're either officers or non-commissioned officers. And they'd already been there a number of times. And it was fascinating to me to have a conversation with them about how a nation develops from this early stage. And these are graves from the 1970s. Yoni Netanyahu, the commander of the Entebbe raid, I showed last week, that grave, I think, is buried just over here. The uniformity of graves up until about 10, 15 years ago, we'll see, and we saw them last week about the changing and the personalization of those graves. And what does that say about Israeli society? What is heroism? How do you tell the story of who we are as a people through a visit to the National Cemetery? So it's fascinating. One way that Israel tries to do that was, a few years ago, there was a special program to try to personalize the loss. And so in the first Lebanese war, 1982, a soldier was interviewed by, I think, Yediot Ahronot, one of the major newspapers, and he said, metaphorically expressed his fears, concern falling in battle. Soon we'll become a song. Soon we may not be here. A somber statement later inspired this project called Soon We Will Become a Song. Oh, sorry. How did I get to that? Sorry about that, guys. I want this, but I want this. Hold it. I want it bigger. Here we go. Soon we'll become a song. Oh, keeps doing it. Sorry. This is part of the song. What do I keep doing here? Hold it. Let me try this one more time. Oh, keeps going to the. That's why. Okay. So what happens is they launched this project, and the idea is that ever since 2001, going back to 1948, they take texts from letters written by soldiers and they make them into songs, including this one by perhaps the most prominent Israeli musician. His name is Idan Reichel. And actually, I can do it this way. This is what I wanted to do. Sorry about this, guys. I'm technically challenged. I'll admit it. There we go. Next song.
You're fine. Don't worry.
I know, but I am technically challenged. That's nice that you say that, Rabbi. But anyway, here is the music. I finally figured out how to do this. There is the music on the right. It's in Hebrew. It's written by a soldier who fell in Lebanon. And this is Idan Reichel. I won't play the whole thing, but I want you to hear the background. Can you read? Are the lyrics big enough for you to read on the right-hand side? I see. Judy's getting too close. No, okay. So I'll try to, listen to a little bit of the music and I'll try to read some of the lyrics.
וכשהלילה תם והשמש מאירה, את תדעי מה לעינינו נראה. עצים סביב, רמי צמרת, החרוכי גזע. בתים גדולים סביב, החרוסים הם דהויי צבע. מעליך על הריסות אני אימא ותם.
So I don't want to play the whole piece, and I'm not going to read all the lyrics, but Idan Reichel is one of my favorite. He's really one of the top performers in Israel today. He takes in a lot of influences in Ethiopian immigrants and Jews from Yemen, and he's a producer and a musician, and he travels. Actually, he's probably performed in Chicago a few times. And when I first heard this song, I didn't realize it was a song written by a guy who fell in Lebanon, right? And as he says, and when the night ends and he's describing his battle in a letter home to his mother, and the sun shines, will you know, Mom, what we have seen? Trees around, towering treetops, but scorched trunks, big houses around, but they are ruined. Their color faded. I'm walking on ruins, Mom, and believe me, here there is no fear. There's no pear and no flower. We are not heroes because our job is grim. The sun will set, the darkness will come, and then we will sleep in our clothes in bed. Yes, Mom, it is important, it is hard, and it is terrible. We are not heroes, he continues, and when the night ends and the sun shines, will you know, Mom, what we have seen? So very powerful. Unfortunately, he did not survive the Lebanese war, but every single year another song comes out based on lyrics, based on letters, I should say, written by soldiers. One of the major sites where a Memorial Day ceremony takes place is the Latrun Armored Corps Museum. Not too far from where I am, about 10-minute drive from where I live in Modi'in. The Armored Corps is the core of all of the IDF that is the heaviest price, that's paid the heaviest price in terms of number of soldiers. There's a big museum over here, and there is a wall. And this wall, which is it on this side, where's the entrance? There's a wall over here where you see a soldier standing from the Armored Corps with his black beret, you can tell, in front of names of everyone. Tzvi Zeif, Yosef Zaid, Zayed, alphabetically, chronologically, of all the soldiers. You can see how many columns there are just from the Armored Corps. Again, not just a number of 24,000, but individuals, each one who has their own individual story. The last day that ends at sunset tomorrow night, when Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers and Victims of Terror, ends, is Yom Ha'Atzmaut. It began to try to celebrate this already after independence. We have a date, right? It's the 5th of Iyar, back then the 14th of May. And in Chanukah, a year later, Mount Herzl becomes the tomb of Herzl, right? He is reinterred, we saw last week. He dies in Vienna in 1904, and he's brought here to Jerusalem. He's buried there. And there was a beacons of heroism, this race by sports clubs. Beacons were brought, candles from all across across Israel. And then a year later, they decided to have the opening ceremony for Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day on Mount Herzl, which is, as I say, when Memorial Day ends. Kids came and lit these beacons, and essentially telling the story of the transition from darkness to light, very reminiscent, by the way, of Hanukkah. 2 years later, they selected 12 Israelis from different parts of society to light a torch, each one commemorating the 12 tribes of Israel. Began to be broadcast live on radio, and only in 1969 when we got TV on TV. And then it's evolved into these torches that symbolize the tribes, as I mentioned, people from different communities. They'll publish tomorrow the list of who the 12 people are, and different themes every year: social action, public service, etc. And it's interesting because this day is around a place. So we talked about, Avram Heschel says, we don't sanctify space so much, but it's more, we have sanctuaries or temples of time. So the place many of you have been to, Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, where on Hey Iyar, the 5th of Iyar, the 14th of November of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion declares Israeli independence, essentially changing the trajectory of Jewish life from being the object of other people's history to the subjects of our own story. Celebrations outside galore, and the last time, lots and lots of people out there, which I think is, and today I was there actually last week. The building is missing, the facade is there. They're in the midst of a 3-year process of redoing and renovating it. And the last time I was actually there was with a group from in December of 2019. Now, what do we do on Independence Day? So try to understand, and I'm a Jewish educator, historian, tour guide, whatever, nice guy, bad sense of humor, whatever you want to call me. But I have one brother, and he's a psychiatrist. So he's, a mental health professional, and I just need mental health support, whatever. But imagine a place where 1 week ago, we mourned the 6 million. And we have there are over 10,000 Holocaust survivors in Israel. Unfortunately, many are dying 40 are dying every single day, but more than any other place. And I know Skokie in your neighborhood has a lot, and you've got a big story there of the American Nazi Party wanting to march and opening the museum way before Washington opened. I know that story. But in Israel, it's much more immediate. I mean, everybody knows. I had a security guard working with me for 2 days, and we're at Yad Vashem today. And he keeps talking to me the entire time. And I'm like, hey, this guy, he was in the Naval SEALs. He's a professional, serious guy. He guides supermodels. He guides the VIP group that I was with for the past week. And he starts telling me the story about his grandfather and his grandmother, and they were the partisans. And it's like, it's a core part of his DNA. And there are millions of Israelis who share very, very similar stories about, who they are, largely is a part of the story that unfortunately took place in Europe between 33 and 45. So we commemorate Yom HaShoah. We get back to work. We hear the siren. We stop at attention, and we meet. I went to my Reform synagogue last week, and there's a woman who was a hidden child who told us her story last week, and there was another guy who told his story, crazy stories. And these are people in their early to mid 80s now, the youngest of the Holocaust survivors. And then a week later, we're asked to commemorate and to sanctify time of Memorial Day, where everybody knows someone who was killed or died in a terror incident or in, while serving in the military. And it's a very somber day. All places of entertainment close on both memorial nights, and restaurants all close. State TV has no movies except connected to the theme of the Memorial Days. And then in schools tomorrow, there's a siren. At the end of the siren at 11 a.m., there's a school assembly. And they read the names of the graduates of the schools who died in action or in training. And then they have a very somber ceremony, and then school ends early. And then tomorrow evening, when there's a transitional ceremony, right? We know how difficult transitions are, but a transitional ceremony ending Memorial Day and segueing into Independence Day. So in the morning, you're visiting a cemetery, many Israelis, of someone you knew. You're standing at attention. Your kids are in assembly in school. And then 5 hours later, you have this ceremony that transitions from commemorating the loss and the price to celebrating that silver platter in a sense, but remembering what gave us that silver platter. So what do? We go and party in every major city park. On the stage, a block from where I'm talking to you right now, is a Memorial Day ceremony tonight. Tomorrow, the top Israeli artists, performers move all around the country at various stages. They do 3-4 songs here, a short set, and it's not like an hour-and-a-half set of the Grateful Dead, followed by another hour-and-a-half set by the Grateful Dead, opened by 2 hours of. Last time I saw the Dead, by the way, Santana did an hour-and-a-half set, and then the Dead did. It's like 3 or 4 songs if you're lucky. Anyway, but they go around, and then people go crazy. They bang each other with plastic cameras. Kids love it. They're up all night, and then the next day, what do? We celebrate by having a barbecue. Because you can't make a sacrifice in the temple because there's no temple. So we'll have some, sheep and whatever. My wife is vegan. She's always the one who prepares the vegan kebabs for the barbecue at our friends where we go to on Thursday. What are the foods? That's my wife, Michelle. So what are our foods? What did I lose you? The foods, as I said, are lots and lots and lots of meat. Everything goes in a pita. You can even put potato chips in a pita if you want. Cake decorated with Israeli flags, salty snacks, sunflower seeds, etc. Every public beach and park, I kid you not, except in my town. Nice living in a new town where there's actually municipal ordinances that people actually follow. 2 years we weren't allowed to have them. People can have them in their yards and their porches, but not in the median in our city, but they do in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And then the highlight is the Air Force doing a flyover all over the country, all types of aircraft, and the aerobatics team. Last year, so 2020, when nobody could go in and celebrate, only 4 aircraft of the aerobatic team flew over all the hospitals in Israel. And you'll see a picture of that. And from the north, close to the border, Lebanon, to the Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, and Yosef Tal all the way down in Eilat. Today, I was in Jerusalem at the marketplace, and we saw the aeronautics. Maybe if I have time at the end, I can put a short little video practicing over Jerusalem. Really, really close. Too close for me, but I'm not a pilot. Anyway, the ceremony. Here's the ceremony. Here are 12 candles being lit. And as I was putting this piece together last year, I noticed that this is the guy who's lighting the candle over it. And where is he? This is Michael Steinhardt. The man who's lighting the candle, the next one who's lighting the candle, this guy over here, he's reading. His name is Professor Ahmed Eid. Ahmed, interesting. Muslim, and he is the head of surgery at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. So anybody wants to say we're an apartheid state, we are not, because you don't have Dr. Ahmed Eid, whose daughter I know and work with, actually. Her name is Kathy. I think the rabbi knows her as well. Interesting story. Jewish mother, Palestinian Arab father who met in the States and live here. And he has saved countless people's lives who were wounded in terror incidents, as well as terrorists, by the way, who were wounded in terrorist incidents. Complicated country we live in. And here you can see what happens when the ceremony ends, right? They all ended and they say in a very patriotic way, and we dedicate this to, the splendor of the state of Israel. And then you can see typical pictures of what goes on in the street, spraying each other, hitting each other over the head, because we're crying in the morning, and literally 12 hours later, we're celebrating out in the street. That ceremony takes place around the grave of Theodor Herzl. I don't know if you can see it. Yes, I did. I marked it in red. There's Herzl's grave we saw last week. You can't even see it, but I wanted you to see where it is. The grandstand over here, members of the diplomatic corps are invited. And then, this is from TV last year, there is a marching procession with different shapes. Nobody knows what the shape is going to be. Is it going to be a Star of David? Is it going to be, say, 74? Whatever. And last year was funny. My youngest son, who's still in the military, one of his close friends, Davidov, was at the ceremony. And for 2 months, literally, as you see celebration throughout the country, for 2 months, they were practicing. And Davidov, see on TV, there it is, live on television. There is his friend standing there as one of the, he's an officer in the military engineer corps. He's standing there proudly waving a flag. They choose someone from each of the units. My son said, glad I didn't have to do too much of training to march in perfect formation, because as I said, Israeli soldiers can't stand at attention for a long time. But look at this on the left, the fireworks. There's a debate in Israel, a growing debate over the fact that there are a lot of Israeli soldiers, people who suffer PTSD. And fireworks don't only terrify dogs, but terrify people who suffer from PTSD in many cases. And so a number of cities, including Tel Aviv this year, not my city, have decided that this year, they're not going to have fireworks displays. Fascinating that this is part of the conversation as well. Just like the nature of how we commemorate Shoah and heroism has changed, right? It's not just those who fought back in the ghettos and with the underground and in the forest with the defiance, with the whatever, those who fought back in the forest. We need to remember that there are a lot of people in Israel who suffer from PTSD. And it's not just soldiers, it's people who live next to Gaza and next to Lebanon and have rockets and hear lots of bangs. And this terrifies a lot of people. So that's part of the public conversation, which nobody would have even raised years ago. Last year, here were the people, various people. You see the Minister of Education and Minister of Culture over there, talking with the 12 people that they had chosen. You can see an Ethiopian Israeli policewoman, a famous musician over here, a Yemenite, an old Yemenite fellow who's got 86 grandchildren and 93 great or whatever. But just each, there was a theme. I don't remember what it was last year. And these 12 soldiers will lit the flames last year. I don't know who's going to light them this year. Last year, I remember that when I went on Google, and I was misled because I did this presentation, I prepared it for last year, and someone, when I was talking, said, no, it doesn't show up on my Google. I guess they know where I am on my computer, but this came up on my computer. It's Israeli Independence Day. I thought for sure, oh, everybody in the world. Then I realized, don't be so naive, Mike. In Iran, they're going to turn on Google, and Russia, and it's going to say Israel. But we're finally on the map, and it's amazing when you think about it, how far we have come in 74 years. I mean, we've got this big confluence of two streets, not so big streets, I should say, in Jerusalem. Ben Yehuda, this crazy guy, who had this idea of resuscitating an ancient language of prayer and a language of Torah into a living language. And people are like Natan Alterman are writing poetry in a language that was dead. I mean, we talk all over the world today about languages that are dying, right? Whereas this is the only language that I know of that was actually successfully resuscitated, and where his street meets the street of Ben Gurion, our founding father. And I will tell you, in my conversation with my small group around the lunch table today, the last time I was with him, I asked him about 5 of the 11 had never been to Israel, the others had. And I asked everybody, I said, so what's your biggest takeaway? And the last person sitting next to me, his name was Mike, I remember his name, said, what struck me, one of the things, was that everywhere you went, including in the art museum that they saw yesterday, and including on the street signs, there are 3 languages. There's Hebrew, there's Arabic, and there is English. And he said, it's amazing. What country in the world, never been to Israel, does the language of the enemy, is the language of the enemy written on the street signs? And I say, well, there is no other country that I know of like this, but it's not the language of the enemy. Because remember, 1 out of every 5 Israelis are Arabs. They speak Arab. Dr. Eid is a professor. He's in charge of surgery at the Hadassah Hospital. He is Arab. He's a citizen of Israel. And the Arabs are not the enemies of the Jews. Rather, Israel is in conflict with the people who are called the Palestinians, who aren't necessarily our enemies. Hopefully, in our lifetime, in the not too distant future, they can be a little bit closer to us. So there's that aspect. The second aspect is, look at this. This is, you might recognize him, the Pope at the Western Wall. He didn't come for his bar mitzvah, right? He's here. Why? What does it mean? When the leader of the Catholic world, the most powerful, significant, cleric in the world, comes to Jerusalem, comes to Israel, goes to Jerusalem, and leaves a note in the Western Wall. What does that say about the 1900-year troubled relationship between Jews and Christians, about Christian supersessionism and triumphalism? So we've come a long way, and that has to do, by the way, with the Holocaust and with independence, and of course with Nostra Aetate, 1965, the Second Vatican Council. We me personally have come a long way. This is me when I was in England in 2002, I think 2003. That's me, and the bigger one. My eldest son, who's now a 29-year-old contractor in Tel Aviv, who employs Palestinian laborers in the West Bank. Our daughter, who's now studying up in the Galilee, and our gangster son, the 24-year-old, who spent 4 years in the Air Force in England at a Zionist summer camp. They're all sabras. They're all born in Israel. And like the cactus fruit, the prickly pear fruit, they're supposedly rough on the outside, but once you peel away that very sharp and prickly outer veneer, they're very soft on the inside. They're soft on the outside as well, trust me. But yet, they're all three of them have done their time in the military, and all three of them have heavy thoughts as we commemorate Memorial Day this week. What do we do besides meat? What do we eat? Well, the classic Israeli snack foods. We have potato chips and we have pretzels, but not nearly as much. Of course, Bamba, I'm going to put in an advert here. Buy it for your grandkids, unless they're allergic to peanuts. It's the healthiest snack food alive. It's like Cheetos, except it's got peanuts, oil, and reinforced vitamins. This other stuff I wouldn't recommend because there's a lot of MSG in it, but Israeli chocolates, Israeli beastly. We have lots and lots of that stuff between the beers and, of course, the major foods that we have, the meat on the skewers. In fact, this young man is demonstrating one of our two national sports. It's called basically you take this little piece of plastic, which I saw for sale in a supermarket last week, and your job is, you work in the upper body strength, go backwards and forwards, and you fan the flames on this portable barbecue that you put somewhere, maybe in the median in Tel Aviv, maybe on the beach in Haifa, whatever, and you barbecue meat. Now, the other national sport, by the way, is something called matkot, or kadima, where you hit a ball backwards and forwards along the beach. We've put everything, as I said, from our barbecue, all sorts of grilled meats into our pita. The more the merrier. Add lots of different sauces of it, and you celebrate life with this one national sport of barbecuing. The second national sport, here it is kadima, matkot. There are no rules. That's why it's our national sport. You just hit the ball backwards and forwards until you're annoying to the people who are around you because the sound or because the ball lands in their pita with something in it. And of course, you just hit the ball backwards and forwards and backwards, and have lots of fun. Every year, one of my favorite breweries in Israel comes up with a limited edition of beers, Malka, or Princess beer, it's called, really good beer. And here you can see Menachem Begin, our former prime minister, in a caricature, Golda Meir smoking a cigarette in a hipster, I guess this would be the style, Ben Gurion with a pale ale, and my favorite beer, I actually shared one with my son last night, it's called an IPA, Indian Pale Ale. And when they made this about 4 or 5 years ago, they put a caricature of Gandhi on it. And they got a lot of flack from the Indian embassy in Israel. They said, you can't do that. That's not fair. No, we don't. You're mocking. So they took it off, and now it just is the IPA. They put a bird there. Last year, by the way, that limited edition of birds, famous national birds, the Hopi are national bird, on the same brewery, Malka beer. The Air Force flyby, I said, as I'm reaching the end, I got 4 more slides, then we'll go to questions. I see the rabbi. In 2020, they just had the 4 planes, I said, of the aerobatics, and you can see they did a heart over each of the 4 hospitals. This is over the Wolfson Hospital in Holon. Thankfully, we're past that stage of corona now. You can see them different times. Probably the best expression of the fact that we're able to defend ourselves are these F-15s and then the new F-35I flying over the country. Here's the hospital staff. You can see 2 years ago greeting the pilots. And this guy later became our coronavirus czar. He was the head of the hospital, one of the hospitals in Tel Aviv. More pictures of the flybys. And last year from our place, we saw some of the helicopters. I'm just putting these up there. Some of the aeronautics. This is as close as they got from our porch on my phone. I took these pictures. And how do you know when they're coming? Well, last year on the paper, on the internet, it said, in my town, Modi'in, between 11:43 and 12:13, here are the following aircraft that are going to fly over your city. So I went, and I got to tell you, they were perfectly on time. There is nothing like the Israeli Air Force. Doesn't mean that my 24-year-old is always on time, but that's another story. All I can say at this point is, last week, we visited sacred space. This week, we visited and understood those 10 days of our national holidays in sacred time. Next week, I think we're talking about politics, if I'm not mistaken, the political system. And the week after that, we're going to talk about the issues presented in Israeli society by the street artists in the area of South Tel Aviv. So bake yourself a cake for Independence Day. You've got another day to do so. That's me in the height of Corona with the limited edition Corona Independence Day mask. And hopefully we'll see you guys in Jerusalem in that too distant future.